I was watching a congressional hearing the other night, just, having it on as background noise while I was cleaning up. And there was a senior official, a man responsible for, billion-dollar decisions, sitting in the hot seat. At first, he seemed totally in command. Sharp suit, stern look, surrounded by this whole phalanx of aides. He really looked every bit the part of a seasoned leader. But then, the questioning shifted. A representative asked him something that required a bit of on-the-fly synthesis, a question that wasn't on the note cards. The change was instantaneous, and honestly, it was painful to watch. His eyes actually glazed over. He didn't just pause to think. He completely froze. Then he started repeating the same rehearsed phrase over and over, getting louder each time, as if volume could somehow replace logic. He looked exactly like a student who had memorized all the textbook definitions to pass a test, but didn't actually understand a single underlying concept. And of course, most of the internet saw that clip later and immediately started memeing it, calling him senile or out of touch. But watching his desperate, almost frantic reliance on those memorized lines, I realized we were all missing the darker reality. We assume these leaders are failing in the moment because of, age or individual incompetence. But what if they are doing exactly what they were trained to do? What if we aren't looking at a glitch, but at the graduating class of an education system that started dying 40 years ago? That moment, that image of a leader completely frozen because the script ran out, that is really the essential snapshot for our deep dive today. Our mission is pretty direct. We are investigating the correlation between decades of declining critical thinking and, analytical skills in national leadership. We're attributing that to systemic educational failures, and we want to look at its measurable impact on a country's long-term economic competitiveness and its capacity to innovate in what is, a rapidly evolving global market. So we'll explore the dysfunction, the deep roots of this educational rot, and then the necessary blueprints for a comprehensive reform.
It's the most high-stakes demonstration of rote learning failure you could possibly imagine. And you hit on the critical point. The leader in question looked the part. They had all the trappings of authority, the suit, the aides, that stern, confident look. They checked every single box for what we expect a leader to look like. But the second that genuine problem-solving, that on-the-fly synthesis you mentioned, was demanded, the cognitive capacity it wasn't there.
The knowledge only existed in this fragile, memorized state. It couldn't be adapted.
Precisely. And we see this pattern across all sorts of high-stakes environments, whether it's politics, corporate management, even in complex technical fields. This isn't just, accidental incompetence. It is a predictable, almost systemic outcome of an education model that for decades has prioritized easy-to-measure memorization and recall over complex synthesis and critical judgment.
So the system trained them for regurgitation.
Exactly. And when the test suddenly changed, they failed, predictably. That desperate, frantic reliance on the rehearsed lines, that becomes the signature symptom of a really profound systemic failure.
And when that failure is widespread across an entire leadership class, the implications. They shift from, individual performance reviews to a genuine national existential threat, which brings us right to the political manifestation of this cognitive decline, what some call constitutional rot. Now, that's a term we really need to unpack because it sounds incredibly extreme, but it defines the gravity of the problem.
It does. Constitutional rot is far more severe than the usual political battles or the gridlock that frustrates voters. It's defined as a protracted period of decay in representative institutions. Essentially, the nation's constitution, foundational document, and its processes, it gradually fails at being what it purports to be.
So if a nation claims to be a democracy or a republic for the public good, this rot means that core function is just eroding from the inside out.
That's it.
But I guess I'm wondering, how is this different from just a period of intense polarization or just a rough patch in democracy? We still have elections after all.
And that is the essential difference. Constitutional rot is so insidious because it's not a dramatic, sudden crisis. It's not a situation where the law is openly defied or the government is paralyzed. It is a slow structural degradation. The outcome is a slide into what is functionally an oligarchy or a plutocracy or even a kleptocracy, even if the regular outward forms of democracy, like elections, continue to be held.
Wow. So the system still looks functional on the surface.
On paper, yeah.
So the appearance of democracy is still there. We vote, we have hearings, but the foundational purpose of promoting the public good has been completely hollowed out.
Exactly right. The institutions, they become less responsive to the broad public, but they become extremely responsive to concentrated private power. And this leads directly to what's known as the oligarchy critique. The argument, which has been intensifying since the 1980s, is that the political environment forces representatives to constantly prioritize raising massive amounts of money for their campaigns.
Which fundamentally changes who the representative is actually serving.
It has to. The representative becomes this agent caught between multiple principles. You have the broad, diffuse public on one side, and then you have the concentrated wealthy interests who fund their political existence on the other.
And it's pretty clear who wins that fight.
Well, because the representatives fear alienating their donors, they become agents who often simply cannot adopt policies genuinely aimed at the broad public good. They have to fear the interest of these entrenched financial sectors. So the outward structures of democracy remain. Campaign finance laws, gerrymandering. But they're now just mechanisms optimized for retaining power and serving oligarchical interests, not the common citizen. That is the rot in action.
And crucially, this rot is directly linked to the lack of critical thinking skills we identified right at the top. The failure to synthesize information has a measurable, devastating economic consequence.
That's the long-term threat. We are operating in a global market that is evolving at, breakneck speed. It's driven by massive advances in big data, in artificial intelligence, climate science, biotechnology. A workforce, and especially a leadership class, that relies on rote memorization just cannot innovate or adapt quickly enough. It's impossible.
So the weak cognitive skills from this educational failure are a direct threat to the economy.
A direct threat to a country's long-term economic competitiveness and its capacity for future innovation. Think about it. If the people making billion-dollar decisions in government or industry freeze when they're faced with an unscripted, complex challenge, the national economy suffers systemic damage that just compounds over decades.
It paints a very clear picture. The inability to synthesize information under pressure is a direct transmission mechanism for both political decay and economic decline. So we have to turn to the source of the rot, the education system itself. If our leaders are graduating as masters of memorization, it means the system is actively rewarding that exact behavior, what is so fundamentally broken in modern pedagogy.
Well, the crisis, when it's diagnosed by major reform initiatives like the National Education Policy 2020, it points directly to a need for a radical shift away from just content accumulation. We need to move away from excessive memorization and instead prioritize teaching how to learn.
That's a huge philosophical shift, though. It means the value is placed on the capacity, the process, not just on the static information.
Precisely. Educational strategy has to prioritize critical thinking, complex problem solving, genuine creativity, multidisciplinary thinking, innovation, and maybe most vital in the modern era, the capacity for adaptation, for absorbing new material quickly in constantly changing fields.
So this is being framed as a matter of national survival.
It is. When you review documents like NEP 2020, that shift is framed as absolutely non-negotiable.
I want to focus on how the current system reinforces this rote learning through its metrics. The conversation about pedagogy, it so often centers on the type of assessment used.
It does. And the current system often suffers from these perverse incentives created by what's called summative assessment.
Okay, what is that exactly?
Summative assessments are the tests that measure mastery at the end of a unit, or a term, or a final exam. And because they're high stakes and standardized, the whole system naturally optimizes around them. And that fosters the very coaching culture you were talking about. Students are trained narrowly to pass the test, not to understand the underlying concepts or apply them flexibly.
So the goal isn't learning. The goal is measuring the ability to parrot back information successfully on a specific date.
On one day. Exactly. And this is completely antithetical to generating the adaptive leaders we desperately need. The reform movement insists we have to pivot heavily toward formative assessment.
And how is that different?
Formative assessment is continuous. It's developmental. It's designed to help the teacher and the student revise the learning process in real time. It focuses on continuous improvement and filling gaps, prioritizing learning development throughout the entire process, not just at the end.
So if the ultimate goal of education is to produce ethical, rational, and adaptive individuals ready for, gainful, fulfilling employment, that requires a measurement system that looks at the whole person, not just the rote score. Because if you can only repeat what you were taught, the moment the real world asks you a new question, you become obsolete.
Just like that official in the hearing room.
Exactly.
And that leads us to a deeper, even more entrenched problem within the educational profession itself, beyond just curriculum design. There is a persistent science-aversive culture. a resistance to evidence-based methods that has been critiqued for decades.
This idea that teaching is somehow resistant to empirical evidence it's fascinating. What's the foundation of that critique?
The foundational critique really came into the mainstream in the late 1990s with the evidence-based education, or EB, movement. An influential English academic, David H. Hargreaves, gave a lecture in 1996 where he made the stark claim that teaching is not a research-based profession.
That's a very strong statement. How did he contextualize that?
He drew a direct and, frankly, uncomfortable parallel to medicine. In medicine, physicians are professionally and ethically obligated to keep up to date on empirical data, on peer-reviewed research, on evidence-based clinical practices. Hargreaves argued that teaching should hold itself to the very same standard.
So what did he propose?
He suggested a dual path. First, educational research itself needed a radical reform to provide more usable, reliable data. And second, teachers needed to become much more engaged in actually applying that research.
But it seems like the bigger hurdle isn't a lack of research, but the internal culture. Why is empirical adoption so challenging within the teaching profession?
It really boils down to a reliance on subjective experience over validated data. Study after study demonstrates that teachers' beliefs about what works are often guided by their personal, subjective experiences, but anecdotes, or just what feels comfortable and traditional, rather than rigorously evaluated empirical data.
Can you give us a concrete example of a practice that's really pervasive but lacks that empirical backing?
Oh, certainly. Two of the most common and persistent are a high belief in methods like matching instruction to supposed learning styles. Auditory, visual, kinesthetic.
Right, I've heard that.
Everyone has. That, or relying on the outdated cone of learning model. Belief in these approaches remains remarkably high among educators everywhere, despite a glaring absence of empirical evidence that shows tailoring instruction to these supposed styles actually improves learning outcomes.
That's genuinely shocking. So we have widely accepted, almost foundational classroom practices that are, in effect, educational myths. If practice is driven by fads and subjective comfort instead of rigorous evidence, what are the long-term consequences?
The long-term consequence is what critics call the science-aversive culture of K-12 teaching. When the profession is seen as being guided by subjective beliefs or the latest guru, rather than robust data, it suffers a loss of professional respect. And more importantly, it fails to optimize its own methods. It becomes vulnerable to promoting ineffective trends.
I can understand the desire for empirical data, but I can also imagine applying the gold standard of medical research like randomized controlled trials, RCTs, to the complexity of a real classroom is incredibly difficult, maybe even inappropriate.
And that is precisely where the EBE debate pivots. Critics argue that while the medical model of RCTs gives you high certainty, it might be too reductionist for the complex human dynamics of a classroom. So many reformers now advocate for a shift toward evidence-informed teaching.
Evidence-informed.
Right. This acknowledges that robust research evidence must influence practice, but it has to be combined with the teacher's professional judgment, their context, and their personal experience. The point is not blind adherence to data, but making sure the practices used in the classroom are validated and measurable.
So there are organizations out there dedicated to closing this gap, to validating these methods.
Yes, the infrastructure does exist. Groups like the Education Endowment Foundation and the What Works Clearinghouse critically evaluate educational research using very rigorous study designs. They categorize the evidence, providing clear support for interventions that have strong, moderate, or promising backing. They're designed to be the bridge between empirical research and the classroom, making sure educators have accessible data on what actually drives learning, specifically those higher-order skills we need.
This all speaks to a systemic failure in methodology, but that failure is dramatically compounded by a crisis in just foundational skill acquisition. If you can't get the absolute basics right, nothing else matters.
The foundational skills crisis is the most urgent, necessary prerequisite failure we have to address immediately. We're talking about an inability to comprehend basic text or perform basic arithmetic, foundational literacy, and numeracy. Without this, all future schooling and all lifelong learning capacity are just blocked.
Let's get specific with the numbers here, because they really communicate the sheer scale of the national disaster we're facing.
The data is alarming. Governmental and non-governmental surveys indicate that we're in a profound learning crisis. We're an estimated over 5 crore, that's 50 million, students currently in elementary school have not attained foundational literacy and numeracy.
50 million. 50 million students who cannot read a basic passage or perform basic arithmetic. That is an enormous segment of the future workforce, the future leadership class, that is locked out of comprehension and synthesis before they even get to middle school.
It's an insurmountable obstacle built right into the system. If a student can't do foundational reading, writing, and arithmetic, the rest of the curriculum, no matter how engaging or inquiry-driven or technologically advanced it is, it becomes irrelevant.
It's like trying to build a skyscraper without laying the foundation.
Exactly. This failure creates systemic future incompetence. Therefore, the absolute highest priority for any educational reform has to be an urgent, time-bound, national mission to achieve universal foundational literacy and numeracy in primary school, targeted by 2025.
And addressing this has to be a multi-pronged approach, right? It must demand everything from massive teacher recruitment to radical curriculum changes focused solely on these basics.
Absolutely. It requires filling teacher vacancies, ensuring a strict pupil-teacher ratio, and implementing continuous formative assessments specifically designed to track and close those learning gaps immediately. It also means bringing in innovative pedagogical solutions, like developing interim 3-month play-based school preparation modules for grade 1 students, especially for those lacking early childhood care, and leveraging community involvement like structured peer tutoring to close that 50 million learning deficit as rapidly as possible.
So we've established the cracked educational foundation. Now we need to bridge this failure directly to the systemic dysfunction we see in high-level leadership selection, which takes us right back to that frozen official in the hot seat. How does organizational theory explain why leaders who lack competence can rise to the top?
For that, we use a framework called the principal-agent problem. This theory comes up when an agent, say a high-ranking official, a politician or a representative, is expected to act on behalf of a principal. And in governance, the principal is the public, the constituents.
But government is complicated. There isn't just one principle.
Exactly. And the problem intensifies with multiple principles. In government, the broader public is a diffuse principle. It faces a massive collective action problem. It's just hard for millions of people to organize their demands coherently. On the other hand, powerful lobby groups or wealthy interests act as concentrated principles. They can lobby the agent, the official, for their individual, intensely specific interest rather than the collective interest.
And the agent's focus inevitably shifts.
It shifts to satisfying the intense demands of the most influential organized principles.
So the education system trains them for rote answers, and the political system incentivizes them to serve these narrow, concentrated interests. How does the incentive structure actively select for low-competence, high-risk agents?
That's where two key concepts come into play. First, there's the incentive intensity principle. This suggests that the optimal intensity of incentives, how much effort an agent puts in, depends on how precisely the desired activities are assessed. So if the public good, the actual quality of nuanced governance, is hard for the public to accurately assess, or if the assessment mechanism, like an election, is flawed or opaque or easily manipulated, then the incentive structure just breaks down.
In simple terms, if the public can't tell the difference between a high-quality, complex governing effort and just low-quality political theater, why would the agent choose the high effort?
They won't, precisely. They will gravitate toward visible, high-risk, or overtly manipulative behaviors that look like effort and get media attention, but are ultimately just inefficient governance. And this is where the tournament models of competition become crucial for understanding leader selection.
How do tournament models apply to political or bureaucratic promotion?
Competition for promotion or for election often incentivizes agents, especially those who are weaker or less competent, to take risky actions rather than genuinely increasing their baseline effort. This risk-taking is a cheap way to improve their prospects of winning the tournament.
Particularly when the system can't accurately assess the quality of their true foundational effort.
Exactly. So the system actively rewards the rote learner leader, the one who lacks foundational synthesis skills, because they are the most likely to gamble or engage in theatrics to win the promotion, knowing they can't compete on genuine long-term competency.
And that dynamic is fundamentally inefficient.
Terribly. It increases the overall risk within the leadership pool without increasing the average productive effort supplied by the candidates. By rewarding manipulation and short-term dramatic actions over demonstrated competence, the system selects for the very type of rote learning leader who, when faced with an unscripted crisis, will freeze.
This structural failure in rewarding merit then feeds directly into the larger environment where democracy has to operate, the public sphere itself. If the system rewards manipulation and leaders are fundamentally incompetent, how can a democracy even function?
A functional democracy requires a robust, well-functioning public sphere. And this isn't just about allowing free speech, it demands two non-negotiable elements. You need a shared sense of facts and a joint commitment to truth. Without that shared reality, promoting the public good, which is the fundamental purpose of a republic, is nearly impossible.
You can't solve a problem if half the population doesn't agree the problem even exists or what the relevant data is.
Right, and we are clearly seeing that shared reality under profound strain globally right now.
So what upholds it?
Well, democracy requires institutions that are dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge. This includes the educational institutions we're discussing, schools, colleges, universities, as well as scientific and research institutions and journalistic institutions that reliably gather and report facts. These are the connective tissue of the public sphere that allows for informed decision-making.
So when educational institutions fail to teach scientific temper or evidence-based thinking or critical reasoning, when 50 million students lack basic literacy, they aren't just failing the student. They are actively undermining the public sphere's ability to maintain that shared sense of facts.
Exactly. Educational failure becomes a powerful accelerant for political decay. We produce citizens who lack the adaptive, critical reasoning skills they need to filter, synthesize, and judge the influx of information they receive.
Which makes them easy targets for misinformation and simple emotional appeals rather than complex policy discussions.
And then on top of all that, digital media introduces another immense layer of complication: the fragmentation of information delivery.
Echo chambers.
Researchers suggest that digital media environments, with their ability to create those echo chambers and rapidly spread low-quality or manipulative information, are actively undermining democracy around the world. And what's critical here is that this challenged disinformation, algorithmic manipulation, fragmented realities, it transcends specific constitutional structures. The problem is universal, and the only long-term defense is a citizenry and a leadership class trained in high-level critical thought.
Which brings us finally to the prescription. If the problem is this systemic, the solution has to be a complete overhaul. So let's turn to the reform models, specifically the framework in the National Education Policy 2020, which provides a comprehensive structure for building the next generation of critical thinkers. The first radical shift is reorganizing the entire learning journey.
Yes. The foundational structure of schooling is being completely reimagined to better align with a child's cognitive and emotional development. Moving away from the traditional 10+2 structure, the proposed overhaul shifts to a 5+3+3+4 structure, covering ages 3 through 18. This is not just an administrative change. It's designed to optimize learning stages based on what we know about child development.
So walk us through those 4 optimized stages and what their focus is.
It begins with a 5-year foundational stage for ages 3 to 8. That includes preschool and grades 1 and 2. And it focuses heavily on multi-level, play-based learning and achieving that basic literacy and numeracy. Next is the 3-year preparatory stage for grades 3 to 5. This is where literacy and numeracy are solidified and the introduction of more formal classroom learning begins. Then the middle stage, that's 3 years for grades 6 to 8, is where specialized subject learning begins in earnest. And finally, the 4-year secondary stage, grades 9 to 12, allows for greater depth, critical thinking, and crucially, flexibility in subject choice, breaking down those rigid academic streams.
This whole structure seems explicitly designed for holistic development. What does holistic development actually mean in practical classroom terms?
It's the intentional effort to move beyond pure cognitive acquisition. It means the curriculum aims not just for high-level capacities like critical thinking and computational fluency, but also for building character, creating ethical and rational individuals, and embedding 21st century skills like communication, teamwork, resilience, and compassion.
So the goal is a well-rounded individual, not just a high-scoring one.
That's it. And the mechanism for achieving this is directly tied to addressing that rote learning epidemic, reducing curriculum content.
Which seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense.
It's absolutely essential. Curriculum content has to be reduced significantly down to its core essentials. The mandated content must focus intensely on key concepts, applications, ideas, and problem solving. The whole purpose of the reduction is to create space in the day and in the student's mind for critical thinking, for inquiry-based projects, discovery-based learning, discussion, deep analysis. It fundamentally shifts the classroom from passive reception to active interaction.
So we move from content acquisition to skills application. And beyond just trimming the textbooks, the actual method of instruction has to change. It sounds like experiential learning is being mandated as the standard practice.
It has to be adopted across all stages of that 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 structure. This includes hands-on learning, integrating arts and sports into education, and adopting storytelling-based pedagogy as the standard, not some supplementary activity.
What does arts integration look like?
It means using various forms of art, music, visual arts as the basis for learning concepts across different subjects.
So like learning mathematical ratios by composing music or understanding physics through sculpture.
Precisely. And sports integration uses physical activities not just for fitness, but to help develop crucial life skills, leadership, collaboration, self-discipline, teamwork. This constant applied interactive process is the pathway toward competency-based learning. It ensures that the system measures what students can actively do and synthesize, rather than just what they can memorize and repeat.
And if we accept that national economic competitiveness is threatened by these weak adaptive skills, the reform has to prioritize skills that are vital for the new global economy, especially big data, AI, all the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution.
That is the core mandate of the skills section. While students are given flexibility in choosing subjects, a set of core capacities must be learned by all to ensure they're productive and innovative. So beyond scientific temper and ethical reasoning, there's a substantial, explicit emphasis on digital literacy, coding, and computational thinking.
This suggests a massive elevation of mathematics and computational thinking, starting much, much earlier than traditional models.
It does. They were emphasized right from the foundational stage, recognizing how critical they are for future fields like AI, machine learning, and data science. And crucially, coding activities are specifically introduced in the middle stage for grades 6 to 8. This makes sure that students are exposed to the logic and principles of programming and data management long before they reach university, directly combating that cognitive rigidity that produces the rote learning leader.
And addressing holistic development, the curriculum also seems to integrate vocational exposure for all students, regardless of their intended academic track.
This is a radical and necessary shift. The goal is to break down the historical stigma that's been attached to vocational work and make sure all students are well-rounded. All students will take a fun, bagless course during grades 6 to 8.
Bagless.
The term bagless is key. It signifies a structured break from the traditional content-heavy academic day, and it emphasizes practical skills and connecting learning to the community.
And what kind of crafts are we talking about here?
We're talking about a hands-on survey of important vocational crafts that are mapped to local community needs. Carpentry, electric work, gardening, pottery making, maybe textile arts. The idea is genuine hands-on exposure, not a theoretical lecture. And this culminates in a 10-day bagless internship period sometime during grades 6 to 8.
A 10-day internship in middle school with local experts.
Yes. All students will intern directly with local vocational experts, a carpenter, a potter, an artist, a mechanic, gaining critical, real-world hands-on experience. This commitment to integrating vocational exposure is essential to make sure that future leaders understand and respect all forms of knowledge creation, whether it's academic or technical.
We've saved the most critical element for last, assessment. We established that the primacy of rote-based summative testing is what encourages the dysfunctional coaching culture that selects for these high-risk, low-competence leaders. The assessment system has to fundamentally change if we want to change the outputs.
The transformation has to be comprehensive. Assessment needs to move from merely testing rote recall to one that is regular, formative, and competency-based. The system must test higher-order skills analysis, critical thinking, problem-solving, and conceptual clarity. The primary purpose has to shift entirely to being assessment for learning, helping both teacher and student continuously diagnose and improve.
And the high-stakes board exams, the ultimate stressor driving that coaching industry, how are they being reformed to discourage rote learning?
The goal is to eliminate the external pressure that makes coaching necessary in the first place. Board exams will be made easier in the sense that they will be redesigned to test core capacities and competencies rather than the detailed memorization required for that coaching-intensive success. Any student who engages in genuine, continuous effort in the classroom should be able to pass and perform well without needing expensive external training that's optimized purely for recall.
And reducing that high-stakes pressure is vital for addressing student mental health and promoting genuine engagement.
Absolutely. To address this, students will be allowed to take board exams up to twice a year, one main examination and one for improvement, if they want. Furthermore, boards are being encouraged to develop modular or semester systems, which would distribute the consequence and the preparation pressure more evenly across the secondary stage, eliminating that single, crushing, high-stakes moment that encourages frantic, superficial memorization.
This level of transformation requires a fundamental change in the feedback students and parents receive, moving away from just a simple percentage mark.
Yes, the standard report card is being completely redesigned. It's going to become a holistic, 360-degree, multidimensional progress card. This report will reflect the progress and uniqueness of the learner across three major domains: cognitive, which is academic skills; affective, which is emotional and social development; and psychomotor, which is physical and skill-based development.
And this includes self-assessment and peer assessment.
Crucially, yes, the report will incorporate self-assessment and peer assessment components alongside tracking progress in project-based learning, inquiry-driven activities, role plays, and quizzes. This is essential for cultivating metacognitive skills, the student's own understanding of their learning process, which is indispensable for lifelong critical thinking and adaptation. They have to learn to analyze their own strengths and weaknesses, not just rely on an external grade.
Finally, for a reform of this magnitude to work across a highly diverse educational landscape, a national body is needed to ensure these new, rigorous standards are uniformly adopted.
That role is proposed for the National Assessment Center, known as PARAC-H. It's an acronym that stands for Performance Assessment, Review, and Analysis of Knowledge for Holistic Development. PARAC-H is designed to be the central standard-setting body.
What specifically does PARAC regulate to ensure that national equivalence?
Its primary function is to set the norms, standards, and guidelines for assessment and evaluation for all recognized school boards in the country, whether they're state or national. This is critical for ensuring equivalence in academic standards and curriculum expectations across the entire system. PARAC will monitor the achievement of learning outcomes and advise boards on new assessment patterns that are rooted in 21st century skill requirements. It ensures the whole system is accountable not just for inputs, but for measurable, comparable outcomes in competency and critical thinking across all demographics.
This entire deep dive, tracing the failure of an official freezing in a hearing room all the way back to the fundamental failure of educational policy, it reveals a profound systemic interconnectedness between the classroom and the highest levels of power.
It's the ultimate feedback loop. The failure of our educational system, characterized by prioritizing low-effort, rote memorization over complex synthesis, is not merely an academic problem. It directly produces a leadership class that is fundamentally incapable of adaptation and high-level critical judgment under pressure.
And this deficiency, when you scale it nationally, contributes directly to constitutional rot. It accelerates the slide toward oligarchy, and it ensures that policy cannot genuinely serve the public good, regardless of election results.
Moreover, this educational and political decay fundamentally threatens a country's ability to remain economically competitive and innovative, particularly in a world driven by continuous disruption from artificial intelligence, big data, and global crises like climate science. The only systemic antidote is comprehensive, evidence-informed educational reform that makes adaptive problem-solving and critical reasoning the absolute, measurable priority, eliminating subjective, non-evidence-based practices from the classroom entirely, and building a leadership pool that's resilient to the unscripted future.